Ooh-doo-doo. Here I am. Here I am. Here I am. Hello. It's been a while. I hope that you can see me. So I have some updates here that I just want to talk about. Some kind of words of caution and some things that I've learned the hard way. So the first thing is I don't know if you've seen previous episodes of this series about death and dying paperwork, end of life paperwork, but you'll know that my dad got sick in April, and so I kind of had to stop a lot of stuff and just kind of refocus my attention on him and getting him better. And he's great now, so that's awesome. So now I can refocus on this work a little bit more. But in that process, I've learned some things that I want to share with all of you guys who are maybe death doulas yourself, or also just kind of going through the end of life process with your family, like a loved one or a parent. So the first thing I want to share is something called judgment proof. And it's something I've learned because just so happened my dad had some debt, which we all have debt. Well, I don't want to say everyone, but most people have debt. I have a lot more than my dad, so this is not me being poo-pooing my dad in any way or trying to be shaming. I have way more debt. But when it comes time to put your loved one in maybe a nursing facility or find a private care facility, a private home for your loved one to go into, there's quite a shift in finances that has to happen. And so if your loved one has any debt that's outstanding, that is something that you have to address, especially if you're the financial power of attorney, which means that you kind of are in charge of that loved one's finances. Then it's good to know what I'm about to tell you. So he kind of went into this with a lot of debt. I had to figure out what living situation was best for him, and I did not want to put him into a nursing home. I'm not a big fan of nursing homes, or at least most nursing homes. There are some really awesome ones out there. So I don't want to say anything bad and like make general sweeping opinions about nursing homes, but just unless I was able to find a really great one that I could afford and that he could afford, then I didn't want to go that route. So the ones that he was approved for through Medicaid were not great facilities. I'm sure if we looked harder, we would be able to find some great facilities, but it just so happens that I was able to find a great private care home, and we were able to afford that. But the only way that we were able to afford that was we needed to use his Social Security. His monthly Social Security check would have to completely go to paying for this private care home. And it came down to, well, then what do you do about his debt? Because he has some outstanding debt, and it was either pay off his debt and send him into a nursing home, or try to find a way around the debt so that he could afford to live in this private care facility. And what I found through going down the rabbit hole of Google is there is something called judgment proof. So when your parents or loved ones rack up a debt, but they have no assets really, so no car, no house, nothing to sell off basically to pay for that outstanding debt. If there's no way to pay for it, then you need to contact all of the creditors or the debtors. You need to contact them, write them this judgment proof letter, which you can go online. I just went online and I Googled it and I found a bunch of different templates for a judgment proof letter, and send it to each and every creditor. And also I sent it by certified mail just to show basically, to show a timeline proof that I sent these things out. So in case the courts come calling in the future, which I hope not, but in case, collections happens, then I have some proof that I have taken steps to notify each and every creditor that that he is in a home, he has no way of basically paying the debt off, he has no ability to pay the debt off, and he has no assets that I could sell to pay the debt off. So it's called judgment proof. And so if a creditor, this is one of the important things that I want to get through to you, and it scared me to death at first, was the idea that I would have to take on my father's debt. Because, as I said, I have debts of my own. So the idea of me being his power of attorney, and having kind of I'm his caregiver, the idea that I would have to take on that debt as well was overwhelming until I looked at the legalities of everything and realized I didn't have to do that. And my dad still could go to a good home. We wouldn't have to go through Medicare yet, and he wouldn't have to go into a nursing home. He could be in a situation that fits with him a little bit better. And so yes, if a creditor calls you and tells you that you have to pay your parents' debt, don't do it. They absolutely cannot make you pay for someone else's debt unless you were a co-signer on a loan or something like that. Then that's a different story. But they can't just automatically say, oh, you have to pay this because you're a family member. That's not right. So do not believe. I've heard countless stories of a person dying, a creditor calling up their family member saying, oh, well, you're going to want to pay off their debt, and like trying to sweep them into agreeing to something. Do not agree to something. I've also gotten letters from these the different credit card companies and things like that asking me to sign their own power of attorney documents. And in the small letters of the power of attorney documents, it says, basically that you'll take over the paying off the loan. And do not sign any of those. So I am currently in the process of, I've gotten all those letters back from the creditors saying you have to prove that you are your father's power of attorney, and sign this power of attorney letter, get it notarized, send it back to us. So what I'm doing is I have my own power of attorney legit paperwork from New York State, which I put in the last episode. So it's in the power of attorney episode. So I'm getting that all notarized. I'm getting a notarized copy for each of his creditors. With it, I'm also sending the judgment proof letter, because they won't take it seriously at first. If you just send the letter, you should also send the power of attorney form and get it notarized. And then I'm hoping that things will work out a little bit better. So that's where I am right now with all of this process. But once I get those notarized copies with the judgment proof letter sent to each and every one of them, certified mail, proving that I sent these documents out, then hopefully it will stop all the creditors and the collections and things like that, the process. He doesn't have that much in debt, so hopefully, they're not going to want to fight this out for, a few $100s. But we'll see. But that, I'm just keeping you up to date, because I know when I first went through this, I was having to make the choice between, am I going to put Dad in a nursing home because he has debt? And in the nursing home, you basically sign over all of your debt, but you also sign over all of your Social Security, and everything gets signed over. Any asset you have, anything for the most part, get signed over to the nursing home, and they would give him, I think, $35 a month in spending money. Or I could just pay for this private home where he has a little bit more independence. He doesn't have credit cards or anything like that. He's not racking up any more debt. But it's his Social Security pays everything. He has nothing left except for $100, and that $100 goes to all of his medications, paying for that monthly medication. So it's really tight, but we're making it work, and things might change in the future. But yeah, it meant the difference knowing that I could do something about his credit and his debt was the key to making sure that he got in the best care situation possible. So I just want to make sure that you guys know that you have more options than they tell you about. And that goes to my next words of caution, I guess, is, and this is going to be a long rant. I'm going to try to make it short. I have a really huge bone to pick with rehabilitation facilities. I am just disgusted by our healthcare system, and especially the way we treat the elderly. Is the more I learn, the more upset and disgusted I become. But back in April, as you know, my dad got sick. He has COPD. He was on a ventilator, and we had a few days before they were going to take him off the ventilator or put in a permanent tracheostomy and keep him on the ventilator for the rest of his life. We decided to take him off the ventilator. He wouldn't want to live that way. And on the second try, he sprung right up and was fine, which shocked us all. He was really great. And so he continued to get progressively better and better. And then they sent him to a rehabilitation facility. So a rehab is kind of a middle point between the person is not healthy enough to go home. So you send them to a rehab, and they are supposed to get physical therapy, occupational therapy. They're supposed to get all their medications sort of worked out. And in the meantime, they're supposed to prepare the family and the home and get the family members ready with any sort of equipment needed. So say they needed a hospital bed in the home, or a walker or wheelchair. They're supposed to be sort of preparing the family to get that family member home as well. Well, none of this happened. So Medicaid only pays for 21 days of rehab. My father went in, and they never told us, first of all, the hospital and the rehab never told us when he was going to be moved in and exactly which facility. They gave me a general idea of the facility. They had me give an okay that this place called Gateway was the only bed open. And so I said, okay, if it's the only bed open, then I guess, is it a good place? And the guy at the hospital was like, yeah, it's good. And the way he said that made me a little leery. So I went online and did some looking, and there were a bunch of horror stories. And before I knew it, I had contacted palliative care. I was like, please help me out with this. And they said, due to COVID, we're not even allowed in that place because they have a 14-day quarantine period in each rehab facility. So they weren't even allowed to get in and see them. And so they were like, we'll try to get in and see them, but they're not really going to let us in for the first 14 days. They're not going to let any of you in. And so it's COVID, I understand. But in that time, we finally learned that he was transferred. So they never told us, and he's there freaking out like, does my family know where I am? They're not giving him any answers. So he's thinking that they whisked him away. No one knows where he is. And he doesn't know how to get in touch with anybody. They didn't give him a phone or anything like that. So then he got anxious, like really, really anxious, screaming, just fearful, afraid to go to sleep because they wouldn't elevate his head. So he spent all that time in a coma, and he felt like his lungs were filling up, and you feel like you're drowning. And all he asked for was to have his head elevated above the rest of his body so he didn't feel like he was drowning. And when he was trying to sleep, he would get that anxiety. And so they wouldn't do that. They just figured they'd medicate him. So they gave him meds. They gave him a little push button to call a nurse call button. And he would just lay on that call button. Nobody would ever come. He'd wake up and he'd soil his sheets and just lay in it all day. Nobody would come. Sometimes they would sit him on the toilet, and wouldn't come and move him off the toilet. So he's just basically sitting there on top of his own filth for hours on the little privy thing. Sometimes in his bed would be soiled. They wouldn't come and change it, and they wouldn't react to the call button. Meanwhile, so this is going on with him. He's getting anxiety. Nobody's ever coming to take care of him, and he's certainly not seeing any. He's not seeing a physical therapist. Nobody's coming in to address his muscle atrophy from being in a coma for weeks. And I'm trying my hardest to contact somebody there. So there's supposed to be social workers at these places that are supposed to bridge the gap between family and the patient and getting the family ready and answering questions. And meanwhile, I'm being ignored. And the funny thing is that I'm calling up and I'm hearing these messages as I'm waiting on hold about, oh, we have these wonderful social workers on staff to make family. We have families that are programs to help families with the transition of having their loved one home and all this stuff. And I'm just listening to this message and I'm like, what a joke. I can't even get a hold of anybody. They're not answering emails. They're not answering phone calls. My brother was able to get a hold of the nurse on staff, but then after a few days, she decided that she wasn't going to answer any more of my brother's questions because it may have been a violation of HIPAA laws or something like that, where she just shut down and stopped saying anything about how he was. And so after maybe a week or so, we were able to get Dad's phone issue worked out, where he was able to get his phone working, so we were able to hear from him, and he was not a happy camper. And so then I got a phone call, I think maybe 17 or 18 days into his 21-day stay. I got a phone call from him saying, oh, they told me that due to COVID, because somebody in the entire facility had come into contact, was just a contact for COVID, that he is not allowed to leave. They are locking the place down, and they made him believe that they are locking it down both ways. I can totally understand people not coming into the facility, but they made him believe that he was going to have to stay longer and not be able to leave the facility. And so I called up Medicare, who pays for these 21 days, and I asked, are they allowed to keep him longer? And they were like, sure. I mean, they can keep him longer, but he can always leave. And that is true. Like, your family member does not have to go into a rehab. They make you at the hospital seem like they have to. They never have to. And as I told my dad, he can always leave. He can leave before the 21 days. He could leave. They can't keep you there, even though they make it seem like they have you. So I talked to Medicare, and Medicare's like, he can leave whenever he wants and is able to, as long as a doctor thinks that it's a good idea, then it's fine. And I'm like, well, he can't stay because of this COVID idea. And they were like, no. And I said, what if he has to stay longer? What if they say we have to keep him? And the lady at Medicare says, well, then his copay is $183 a day for each day that he stays past those free 21 days, which they don't tell you about at the rehab. If they keep you longer with this idea that you have to stay for whatever reason, Medicare is just racking up that copay for you, $183. That's a pretty nice hotel room, basically, that you're paying for every day, and they don't tell you about. So I said, Dad, you're leaving on the 21st day. I have something lined up I have a place for you to stay. I have somebody that's going to pick you up. You're leaving. You're not staying. And then, so he let them know that he's not staying. He can't be kept there. And then they called me up. So a social worker and a nurse called me up. And this is the only time I ever spoke to somebody. And that was 2 or 3 days before the 21 days. So that's the first time I heard from anybody. And it was a nurse and a social worker. And they said, your dad has to stay. He's in such bad shape. You're not going to be able to take care of him. He's wheelchair bound. He can't get out of his wheelchair. He's on oxygen. He can't breathe without it. He's on like 10 different medications. He needs a urinary catheter. He can't toilet himself and all the stuff. They're like, he cannot, and so they said he has a urinary catheter, and then the nurse was like, well, you know, they backpedaled, and they were like, well, that's not totally true. It's more like he has a sleeve, so it's not completely true. So she backpedaled, but they painted this scene of like somebody that was never going to be able to leave. And I said to them, he is leaving. Give me whatever medications he needs. You know, I hope that you are going to provide him with enough. And they were like, oh, we'll only give him 10 days. That should be enough to see a doctor. Well, welcome to COVID. It's really hard to see a doctor within 10 days. So they made it really, really difficult. And they also, I was like, well, so he needs a wheelchair. Oh, yeah, he needs a wheelchair. We're supposed to get you one, but, you know, we won't have one ready for you for another week. And so they just gave me such a horrible runaround and made it really hard for me to get him discharged. And they did everything they could to convince me otherwise. And finally, he was free. For the first week or so, he was with a family member who took care of him. And then my brother transported him up here to where I live, so from North Carolina to New York. And he immediately started walking with a walker and didn't use his, he was able to actually, during the move, he unloaded, not unloaded, but he put away all of his stuff in his room himself. He did all of that himself, not in a wheelchair, in a walker, was able to put everything away. He didn't need any oxygen except for like really strenuous exercise. And he only needed an inhaler. So all these medications that they were telling me that he needed, and I was going to have a hard time getting them because, you know, they were just painting this dire picture that he was going to be on all these meds. He only needs an inhaler. So that was within like a week and a half of being discharged. He's walking with a walker, sometimes not even really needing the walker fully. Still very, very weak, but not using oxygen all the time, only like really when needed. During strenuous activity, which was he puts away his laundry, like immediately, as soon as he got to that place, he started putting away his laundry. And it incenses me because of the picture that they painted to try to keep him. And also, when I told them the 3 days before the 21st day, when they finally called me, and I said, he is definitely leaving. You can't change my mind. That is the irony, is when I spoke to my father, he said, oh, the last 3 days were the only days that anybody came in my room and actually gave me physical therapy. That was the first time anybody had actually shown him what exercises to do to rebuild his body. And that was only because they knew he was leaving, and they kind of had to do something that made him look like they had been doing something the whole time. And also another terrible thing is that as he was leaving, they show him the call button that he was using to try to get help. Well, they